That's a narrative that a lot of activists push, is that like dairy is dying. I think there's a hashtag out there that they love to get behind. And it's actually pretty much completely false. Dairy is the largest sector at the grocery store, and it's the fastest growing sector. And so there's definitely changes, but no, and it's an exciting industry to be a part of. And there's a lot happening. And so I do think that there's a misconception that big means bad. And that's not the case. When my dad came of age, he went out on his own. But what I'm seeing is a lot of families staying together. My husband dairy farms with his dad and 4 out of 5 of his brothers. And so instead of us each going off and having maybe a smaller dairy, what we've decided to do is that it makes more sense for us to stay together and be a larger operation so that we can have a little bit better margins. We have a little bit better buying power where those margins really make a difference.
Okay, hello guys. Happy, what are we on Tuesday today? We have 2 great guests today. We have Natalie Kovarik, correct me if I'm saying that wrong, and Vander, who I've talked to a couple of years ago. Welcome, both of y'all. Thanks for being here. I guess we'll just start it with asking what y'all do. I know, but maybe nobody else does. But maybe Natalie, you go first. Tell us what you do, and then we'll ask Tara what she does.
Yeah, sure. Thanks first and foremost for having us on. I am actually a cattle rancher. So I grew up in agriculture. I grew up in Southwest Montana on a cattle ranch there. I left for an education in pharmacy. And when I graduated, I did actually not return back to the family farms. I was living in a bigger city, practicing pharmacy full time, working at a hospital clinic. And I honestly thought that is what I would do. So sometimes when I'm sitting in conversations like that, about to dive into all the things we are, I just find it full circle that I am back here. I ended up back on a ranch when I married my husband. He is a Nebraska boy. And so that is where we ranch now, is in central Nebraska.
All right. Very good. And Tara, you used to be the New Mexico milkmaid. I'm assuming you're still in New Mexico, but where are you at? What's going on with you?
Yes. Thanks for having me back on. Yeah, I used to be online as the New Mexico milkmaid, and I've since transitioned to just using my full name, but I am still in New Mexico. I am a dairy farmer here in Eastern New Mexico. Similar to Natalie, I grew up on a dairy farm in Eastern New Mexico and then married a man just down the road who dairy farms. And now we dairy farm with his family, several of his brothers, his parents. And I actually got my degree in environmental science. And I've spent about the last 10 years working as an environmental consultant for dairy farms throughout New Mexico. And then recently have started sharing online and really trying to bring dairy farming to people online and just give them access to our farm. And then very recently, Natalie and I started a podcast called Discover Ag, where similarly, we try to talk about agriculture, food, our food system, and just bring a perspective as a dairy farmer and cattle rancher to people about their food.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because both of you have very sort of unique insights. Natalie, with the background in pharmacy, as a physician, I see the effects of chronic disease and the effects that nutrition has on chronic disease. And it's overwhelmingly clear that poor nutrition is driving this. And then also with one of the criticisms of animal agriculture in particular is its impact on the environment. And with your background in environmental sciences, you're positioned to discuss those types of things. And second, I always do, whenever I'm talking to people that feed me, I say thank you. It's hard work. It's a thankless job in a lot of cases. I think people that are in this business are underappreciated. And every time I get a chance, when I speak in front of Cattlemen's Association, I'm always thank you guys for what you're doing, because I think it's one of those things that without food, we all die. But so there are a lot of criticisms leveled at what you do, which I think I guess there's some justification in it, but I think on balance, it's pretty one-sided and pretty very biased. I see that as we're seeing this push towards more of what I like to call is more processed food. When you take animal products out of the diet, what replaces it? It's not celery and broccoli. It's just more ultra-processed garbage is clearly what happens. And it's an important thing to realize. I guess, Natalie, what made you leave pharmacy? Was it the frustration of what you were seeing, or was it the lure of I don't know if you'd call it more simple life, but maybe something out of the rat race? What made you go back into cattle ranching?
So I actually worked part-time as a pharmacist up until about 2 years ago. So I just worked off the ranch, which is actually pretty common in agriculture. There is typically one spouse that will have an income not attached to the operation. It just makes things a little bit more steady in an industry that oftentimes can be not steady when it comes to paycheck. And so I loved practicing pharmacy. It was hard for me to leave. It was a very small critical access hospital here in Nebraska. We live in a very rural community. It's about a town of 2,000, and it was a real joy to be a part of rural health. It's really important from that aspect. And so I didn't intend to make the choice to leave, but I think what I was doing online and what I was doing with Tara was just a little bit more exciting for me at the time. I'm still keep up my credits. And so I fill in pharmacy quite a bit. And so there's perhaps one day down the line when I will maybe go back to it. But for now, I'm pretty content farming, ranching full side along my husband, and then taking to the space online to combat and have the conversations.
Yeah, in case you guys aren't aware, this community is people that are all using animal-based diets to improve their health. And we've seen just literally almost miraculous improvements from anything from multiple sclerosis to chronic debilitating depression, things like that, by including, in many cases, exclusively animal products in their diets. It's essential for human health. I know it's a controversial topic. Because this is something that I think is important. Tara, you're in New Mexico, and I used to live there. It's hot, it's dusty, it's dry. One of the criticisms with dairy in particular is we see a increased pressure for centralization. Small independent dairies in Wisconsin and back east where it was rainy and wet are being sort of put under, and now we're seeing these mega dairies being propped up in places that maybe don't have good water access. And New Mexico is one of them. What are your thoughts, because you're an environmental person, what are your thoughts on some of those criticisms being levied? Is it fair? Is it accurate? Are there problems with that? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, lots of things. So I'll go in a couple different directions. I think one of the things that you mentioned is the differences. Dairy farming is very different from region to region. So dairy farms in New Mexico are going to look so different than dairy farms in Wisconsin. And one of the big differences there is New Mexico is known for its larger dairies. Our average herd size is the largest national average. It's about 2,500 to 3,000 cows. And that is very unique to Eastern New Mexico, West Texas. And one of the reasons is because of our climate. We are able to have our cows outdoor year round because we have a pretty mild climate. It's not too hot, not too cold, somewhere in the middle for the most part, especially out here on the high plains. And so that is one of the reasons that we built this style of dairy. They're called open lots versus someplace like Wisconsin, where you're going to have that more extreme weather. You're going to have more wet weather. And so that's one of the differences. But at the exact same time, you mentioned our lack of water. And that is a big deal in New Mexico. That is a very real thing for us, is not just dairy farms, but overall agriculture, overall our community is worried about running out of water. And so we're doing actually a lot to combat that. We recycle a single gallon of water on our dairy farm up to 5 times, and that's pretty common practice. So that same gallon can just be used over and over again. And then from the crop side, that's where we can really see a big difference, is we are making sure that we are trying to use drought tolerant crops. So we actually work with our land grant universities to try different varieties, bring in a bunch of different types of crops. I feel like when I was a kid, it was like alfalfa and corn. And now at any given time, we're growing like 5 different things, from oats to triticale to like winter wheat, just more varieties that are drought tolerant and that just grow with a lot less water. And then there's other technologies. There's so many technologies that we're implementing that we're able to really reduce our water use. And that's going to be crucial, like moving forward. As a 5th generation dairy farmer, I mean, my husband and I think constantly, how do we get this farm to the next generation? And water is that primary concern. And we've seen a lot of changes already. And I think we'll continue to see changes to be able to conserve water.
Yeah, I guess the contrast between dairy farming and cattle ranching, I think there's 9 million head of dairy cattle in the U.S. and something like we've got, I think the national herd overall is like 93 or something like that, 93 million here in the U.S., which is down significantly from the 1970s when we had about 130 million or something like that. But one of the other concerns is always talked about is methane. And I think that's some places are talking about taxing it, and you got places like in the Netherlands and where I think they're actively shutting down farms. Ireland's talking about culling cattle. What do you see a legitimate path forward for sustainability to reach these climate goals, which some people disagree with? I'm not an atmospheric scientist, so I couldn't tell you, but you hear about it all the time. So let's talk about methane from both sides, you guys, if you don't mind.
Yeah, methane is definitely a hot topic in the news right now, and justified. There are things to be concerned about. It is more potent than carbon, but I think a piece that is left out of the conversation oftentimes is that it is short-lived, right, when we're comparing it to carbon. And so you ask the question, do you think that we're at a position to hit some of these climate goals we're setting in agriculture? And I really, truly believe we are. We've had guest experts on our podcast that have talked about the advancements they're making in feed additives that will really help with methane. And the great thing about methane is that it is short-lived. So think of it as a bathtub analogy. As water is running into the bathtub, we have the drain open and it's water is running out, whereas carbon is plugged bathtub. That water is just accumulating, which would be the same thing with carbon in the atmosphere. So when we think about all these initiatives and different things we're working on in the ag industry to lower our methane, it really sets us up to be in a position where we could possibly be neutral, which I think is really exciting.
Yeah, I've interviewed.
Yeah, I think.
Oh, sorry, I was just going to comment. I interviewed Frank Mittelohner. I've talked about what they're doing at the Clear Center with a, I guess it's algae based or seaweed based additives and things like that. Is that scalable? I'm just wondering if that's something that you're going to be able to produce enough of that feed additive to do that. And how do the cows tolerate it? I mean, I assume you haven't done that with your animals yet, but that's being looked at.
Yeah, Dr. Frank Mittelohner is one of our favorites. He's been on the podcast talking. I definitely think that feed additives are something that we can do at scale. And I think one of the things is there's not going to be one silver bullet, I don't think, to like moving us forward on reducing methane. There's going to be a lot of different ways that we're able to reduce methane. So whether that is the enteric emission, so, the cow burping, or whether that's going to be the manure management side of being able to, especially on the dairy side, where we have like lagoons, be able to really manage those, do some different practices that are able to reduce that methane. And as Natalie said, with it being a short-lived gas, I think it positions agriculture to actually help solve this climate crisis, because we're going to be able to remove carbon from the atmosphere with our soils, our crops, and then reduce carbon emissions from the cattle. And agriculture and forestry are the only industries in the world that their job is to remove carbon from the atmosphere to produce food. That's what agriculture is. By growing plants, whether that be to feed cattle or whether you choose to eat plants, you're removing carbon from the atmosphere. And that is going to be crucial for us to meet those climate goals.
Yeah, what we see, I see a lot of people talking about dairies going out of business. All these plant-based faux milks are going to take over. And there's people that clearly want you guys to fail. I think they're in a minority, hopefully, thankfully. But what is the reality of, is it expanding? I think the overseas market is growing. I think we're exporting more from the U.S. But where do you see realistically dairy in 10 years from now?
Yeah, that's a narrative that a lot of activists push, is that like dairy is dying. I think there's a hashtag out there that they love to get behind. And it's actually pretty much completely false. Dairy is the largest sector at the grocery store, and it's the fastest growing sector. The difference is, I think what people lose sight of is a lot of times we're not drinking that glass of milk anymore. A lot of times we're getting our dairy in different ways, whether that be yogurt or kefir. And you think about all these products that we didn't even have 10 years ago that we now have, or products that we've brought over from other places, Europe, and that have become more trendy here in the United States. And so we're just consuming our dairy in very different ways. Even me this morning, instead of having a glass of milk, I drank a Core Power. So like a higher protein, lower sugar content of milk. That isn't a product that was available 15 years ago. And so there's definitely changes, but no, and it's an exciting industry to be a part of, and there's a lot happening.
Yeah, I've seen that cheese in particular. I think that product sector is going pretty crazy, and it's a good product. I enjoy it from time to time, certainly. And Natalie, let me go back to you on the beef side of things. I know I need to talk about methane mitigation with the manure. I know they have digesters and things like that are significantly helpful, and they can benefit that. But as far as on the beef side of it, there's a lot of people talking about regenerative ag, where it's mass mob grazing, frequent moves and things like that. And is that something that we need to do to meet climate goals? Is that something, is there pros and cons of that? Because there's a lot of people that I hear, they'll say the meat is not good unless it's raised a certain way, or the dairy is not good unless it's done a certain way. And my observation, having seen thousands and thousands of people do it, it doesn't seem to matter as far as clinical health outcomes occur from my observation. But what are you guys' perspective, either of you guys, on that aspect, regenerative ag versus more of an industrial model?
Yes, I hate to toot the beef horn compared to other sectors in the ag industry. But the cool thing about beef is that whether it is grain finished or grass finished, so getting into that conversation of how the animal should be raised, cow's going to spend 2/3 of its life out on grass. So it is technically out on pasture for a very long time, which is very different when you're looking at how pigs are raised or how chickens are raised. And going back to the question you asked Tara about New Mexico dairies to Wisconsin dairies and how things can look different, I think pulling that out big picture is something that's often missed in the animal protein sector, is that we all get kind of lumped together, that we're all, raising and the standards or raising conditions are the same, and they're not. Beef cattle are truly out at pasture. And so I'm pretty proud of the way it's raised. And that's why I consider it like quote unquote regenerative, because I do think for 2/3 of its life, it's in existence with nature. It's working in symbiosis with that. The ruminant animal out at pasture absolutely is key to soil health. There's actually 5 principles to soil health, and a grazing animal is one of them. And then I'm really proud to be a cattle rancher. I think the conversation comes in, then people talk about feedlots in the beef sector. And that's really where you can get some of the nuanced conversation about what could we do to be more regenerative when it comes to having feedlots. I have the same opinion as you. Right now, I don't see much of a nutritional difference between the grass finished or the grain finished that I would promote someone to buy it one over the other. I think that beef is a very nutrient dense product. It has all those essential amino acids you need. It has all of the micronutrients that you can't get. And I think that hearty piece of meat, whether it's being grain finished or grass finished, is important and healthy to put on the plate.
Yeah, that's been my observation. There's clearly, you can analyze them in a lab and you can find some differences, but the actual impact on the human doesn't seem to be different. At least I haven't observed it yet. So maybe we'll see that down the road. But again, people like Alan Savory, I'm sure you're familiar with him. He'll talk about desertification and the fact that if we're not managing correctly, and that a grass-fed animal, if it's not properly managed, can still be relatively destructive. And do you see, even in these like cow-calf operations where they're backgrounded and stuff like that, are you seeing more trends to where we're trying to be more proactive about soil protection or soil regeneration?
Absolutely, yeah. So we're actually a cow-calf operation. That's what the heart of our operation is. And I think every day we're not the only operation taking these measures, but we rotationally graze. So that's something that a quote unquote would be considered regenerative. We do cover crops. The cool thing about in Nebraska, we go from summer pasture to grazing cornfields, which I don't think a lot of people are aware of. And so there's this small period where pasture isn't ready to be put back on in spring. And so we do have to feed. And we're actually looking at maybe doing a very specified cover crop where then we could go from summer pasture to cornfields to cover crop. And that would be our rotation for the animals here, considering we have multiple weather seasons. It's obviously very different where someone isn't covered in snow and doesn't have winter. And so, yeah, we do no-till. And I don't think we're unique in this idea. As a rancher, it is absolutely our job to assess where we're at with our geography, our rainfall, our soil type, our land, our stocking rate. There's so much that goes into how to manage cattle. And that's why I get a little bit hesitant to talk about regenerative when people talk about Will Harris. He's like another very common, very large name in the regenerative game. And it's what he has going on for him in Georgia is excellent for his operation and what his location and what he is doing. I could not physically do what he does here in Nebraska because we get different rainfall. We have different soil type. Like we're in the Nebraska sandhills, so we have sandy soil. So there are so many differences. And my fear when we get into the regenerative discussion is that people aren't seeing it as a spectrum of practices you implement and as a tool that you use as a rancher. They're seeing it as a yes, no. Are you doing what Will Harris is doing? Because if you're not, then you're not regenerative. And that's just not true. Like our job, as I already said, is to really assess where we're at, the type of animals we have, how many we have, and the resources around us, and then implement the regenerative practices specific for our area.
Do either of you see a shift towards different animals, like different animal, not species, but different sort of breeds of cattle to meet sustainable goals? You might, obviously, there's more drought tolerant cattle, there's more heat tolerant cattle, there are cattle that might do better on, I guess, a more regenerative style versus maybe more a feedlot style. Is there any push towards changing the breeds that are coming out? I know we've been messing with cattle breeds for centuries now, but do you see any more further evolution in the genetics?
Yeah, I think genetics is a huge thing for producers. And I wouldn't necessarily say maybe switching breeds, but I definitely think like honing in and improving genetics. My husband and I, we AI so that we can get very specific genetics. We do embryos transplants and those things so that we can get very specific genetics. And when you talk about the sustainability portion of agriculture, I think the common person would be unaware of how important genetics are and how much they can actually play a role in improving sustainability and productivity and efficiency and all of that. And so I think there's absolutely a component of it.
On the dairy side, there's a couple things as far as breeds go. There are people that are transitioning more to Jersey cows. They're a little smaller and they're a little more feed efficient. So they use less feed. They obviously produce less manure then on the back end of things. And so there has been some switch also as dairy farmers are getting paid more for different components in their milk. So having higher butter fat or having higher protein or all of those things are something now that dairy farmers are being paid for versus just volume. The Jersey cow can look a little more appealing. The Holstein is known for being more, I think, a little hardier cow and also produces more, but it's a bigger cow. We personally do a Holstein, but there's definitely conversations of being more Jersey, and we're seeing that. And then we also AI all of our cows and we sex semen to dairy cows. Majority of our dairy cows that are born are female, and the rest of the cows, because we only need about 1/3 what's called like replacement cows. So we only need 1/3 of the cows that are born on our dairy to continue to have the same size herd we have. So the other 2/3 we're actually breeding to a beef cow. And this is something fairly new in the dairy world. And it's actually a big piece of our sustainability so the cows are crosses is what it's called. So it's half beef cow, half dairy cow. And that way those dairy cows can then enter the beef cow operations. They can go and be raised even out on like a ranch or on rangeland. And that's been huge for the dairy business as far as just making that transition of changing up the breeds and implementing that beef on dairy portion of dairy.
Shawn, the other thing I'll add to this, it's not completely, it's like a tangent to this conversation, or parallel is what I meant to say to this conversation. But I also think there's more awareness. I don't know if awareness is the right word, but maybe more thought and intention about like multi-species grazing, which I think we lost sight of along the way a little bit. And I think there are a lot of producers that are now maybe looking back at the power of combining some of the different animals together and what that can do when they're out at pasture. I know on our operation right now, we're strictly cattle, and my husband and I have had a lot of conversations about what it would look like for our operation if we introduced like goat or sheep with our cattle, because it would just pair really nicely out at pasture. And I think that's like a big part of the conversation too.
Yeah, I've seen now where you have multi-species grazing, and the chickens peck through and kill out some of the different parasites, and it ends up being very symbiotic. As a pharmacist, there's one of the criticisms is that, well, all these cows are consuming most of the pharmaceutical, particularly antibiotics in the U.S. because they're big animals, so they're going to have a higher dose. But what is the thought about drug-resistant bacteria developing, and how are we managing antibiotics these days around cattle?
Yeah, so we actually interviewed a vet on our podcast, Discover Ag. It's a very well done interview. So if anyone is listening who really wants to deep dive this topic, I would recommend going over to Discover Ag after and listening to that, because he really gives some detailed perspective about, like you said, just some nuanced conversations. Animals are larger, right? So they are going to require more of the antibiotic. But when he said when you pull it out, what we're using in humans is fairly similar to the amount that we're using in animals. And so really, I think one of the takeaways from that conversation was how this resistance, this idea is, it's not just an agriculture thing, but it should be all of us, right? So whether we're going to the doctor for our kids or us as ranchers are using it for our animals, like we all need to care about how we're using antibiotics and use them appropriately. I will speak as a cow-calf operation. We use antibiotics for treatment. So we are not giving preventative antibiotics. It is only if an animal is noted to be sick. And then they're, of course, always prescribed by a veterinarian. So we work closely with them.
What about the ionophores that have been used in the past for growth promotion? Is that something that's widely still being used, or what are your thoughts on that?
You mean like growth hormones?
I thought there were some antibiotics that actually promoted growth, but maybe I'm mistaken on that. But I thought there was a class called the ionophores, but maybe that's something else. But anyway, there's a question directly for Tara about weaning cattle, beef cattle versus dairy cattle. Apparently they have a different weaning cycle. I'm not sure. Maybe you can speak to that.
Yeah, so that's such a good question. Dairy cow, that's probably one of the biggest differences between dairy cattle and beef cattle is with dairy cattle, we do remove the calf from the mother and we bottle feed them. So we give them their milk in our barn and then ultimately in the calf hutches, and then they move to the group pen. When they move to the group pen is when we wean them. This is one of those things about breeds that's so different. If you watch a video online of like a beef cow, mama cow, she is very aggressive usually. It can be very dangerous to try to treat her calf. Like she is just ready to be a mama cow. On the dairy side, we talked about genetics. That is just not something they have been bred for, is being very good mother cows. They tend to leave the cow shortly after it being born, tend to abandon it, go off, eat, not really come back to the calf. And that really has to do with their genetics. And we do bring the calves into our calf barn. And then, like I said, give them bottle multiple times a day until we wean them at about 3 months or so when we move them to that group pen.
I guess I'd be remiss not to ask, Coach, because people ask me this all the time about proposed mRNA vaccines for cattle in this country or others. Any thoughts, concerns, worries? Are you guys thinking about that? Is it a problem? What are your thoughts around that stuff?
Yeah, so we actually dived in this conversation in that same episode where we interviewed that vet. I will say currently right now, there are no mRNAs used in livestock production. I believe there are possibly, I think vaccines in pig. Is that right, Tara? And maybe chicken?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Are coming, but not in cattle.
Yeah, not in cattle. I can't say there won't ever be in cattle. Obviously, we just can't make that statement. I'm starting to notice something that I really have concern about with like vaccines as a whole. Maybe we can just have a vaccine conversation, because there is so much fear around this mRNA used in animals that people are going to be consuming. The vet talked about, if you want to get into it more, again, go listen to that episode, but he talks about how there is no science to show that it would have any effects on us as humans if we're consuming the meat of animals that have been given this. But aside from that, my real concern as a producer is vaccinations are so important for herd health. I would argue that they are the foundation that we are giving our animals to set them up. And Tara can talk about this a little bit more in milk if she wants to, but they really do set the animal up for a very healthy, productive life. Like they are the preventative thing before we ever have to get to antibiotics. If you don't want to see antibiotics used in animals, we would argue that then it comes down to a very strong, good vaccination protocol that you're setting up with your vet. And I am really concerned that the society, we're shifting to this fear of vaccines in general. And we're going to transition from not wanting mRNA specific to be vaccine used to all vaccines. I just put up a post probably 2 weeks ago showing us running cattle through the chute. And I was talking about a vaccination we were required by law to give. It's a Bangs vaccination. It's for brucellosis. And someone commented, I'm not buying your meat anymore. And we don't even sell direct to consumer. But I just responded back and said, why not? And she said, because you use vaccines. And it's really starting to cause concern to me that we are going to position society to think that vaccines are bad in animals. And it's just really crucial that as producers, we are having them as part of our operations.
Yeah, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think there was a period maybe 100 years ago where like a third of the world's cattle population was killed by some bovine respiratory virus. I think it was in Asia mostly, but it was like hundreds and hundreds of millions of cattle succumbed to that. And I think that's still a real possibility, particularly. And one of the concerns around feedlots is the close proximity that diseases transfer more quickly. And a lot of people that are critical, Will Harris and others, will say, well, that's a real problem. And how, again, your cow calf, I assume you send it to a lot to be finished in Nebraska. What are your thoughts around feedlots?
Yeah, so I see the pros and cons of feedlots. I can definitely see some of the arguing points that someone like a Will Harris would bring to the table about more production of the feedlot system. If you listen to our podcast, you'll hear Tara and I say repeatedly over and over again that we stand for food choice. And I also believe we got to our food system in America for a reason, right? Whether that was consumer demand or shifts that we needed to make because of economic issues for ranchers and farmers or production, environmental issues. Like we didn't just randomly end up here. And so there is value in feedlots. They allow us to produce meat efficiently at high volumes and at an affordable price. And so if you are someone who cares more about that than they do some of the other points, then I can see why you would argue for a feedlot system in our food production. I also think it's important that when people think of feedlots, they remember, again, that an animal is only in feedlot for probably about 6 months on average. I think people have a misconception that a feedlot cow is there for eternity and the only diet that they've ever had is the diet they're getting at a feedlot. And you have to remember that the beef system is segmented and it is very different than all the other protein animal sectors. And so the animal starts out at a ranch like mine, out at pasture. And then, as you already alluded to, we sell to a feedlot who would then buy it and finish it, who then passes it on to the packer. And so I think there's a lot of attention on the feedlot sector. In my mind, I still think that it is an important part of where we are as a food system right now. If we want to make drastic changes to the food system, sure, we can. We can eliminate feedlots, but it would come with a lot of ripple effects and a lot of repercussions for consumers.
I alluded to this earlier about some of the stuff that's going on in Europe, Netherlands over, I think, nitrogen gas, and I don't know what the issue is in Ireland, but general climate sustainability. What makes it different in the U.S. versus those places? Are we in danger of that sort of mandatory calls happening here? Do you guys see that as a realistic possibility?
Yeah, actually, my family is directly from the Netherlands. We still have first cousins that dairy farm in the Netherlands. And so we've been on Discover Ag following that story pretty closely. I think that there are concerns, not necessarily like imminent, but it's just, to me, it feels like a lot of times the United States will follow behind what the EU is doing. And I just feel like it's a little bit the writing on the wall. And just last week on Discover Ag, we talked about John Kerry making some comments about seeing what was happening in Europe and that the United States should be considering something similar. And so I don't know that there's like an immediate threat. I don't think anyone's knocking on Natalie and I's door, like saying they'll pay to take our cows. But I just think that it's something we need to be aware of, and we need to be watching, and we need to be keeping like our finger on the pulse of what's going on there and how it's influencing politicians and policy here. And that's where I get worried, is just that influence that will trickle down from the EU to the United States.
Yeah, myself included, because I like eating meat and occasionally doing dairy products. I don't want to see that resource go away, because I think it is, again, from my aspect, I've just seen so many people get healthy doing this, and I think it's important to maintain that in any way possible. What are some of the top misconceptions that people will say about either of your guys' profession? We hear all about how cruel it is to the animals, and what are some of the things that people claim that maybe there's some nuance or some insight behind that?
Yeah, I think one thing I would mention, we talked about the cow's diet, the cow's health. We have a nutritionist that plans all of our cows' diets for every stage of life they're in. We have a vet that comes in once a week that does herd health checks. And that vet is who prescribes all of our antibiotics. On the dairy side, and it's similar with the beef, if we were to treat a cow with antibiotics, there's a withhold or withdrawal period where they can't enter the beef supply system. Their milk does not enter the food supply system. It's milked completely in a separate line. Every single tanker of milk that leaves our farm is tested for antibiotics and a bunch of quality standards. It's a lot of things besides just antibiotics, but it's tested all the way to the parts per trillion. And if for some reason a tanker came back and did not meet standards, like we'd have to dump that milk and we'd have to pay for it. And some of those standards are even like, it has to be cold enough, it has to be 36 degrees. If it's 37 degrees, they won't pick it up. Like very detailed, a lot of checks and balances. It's tested again at the plant. So I think there's a lot that goes into the food safety side of things for both beef and dairy that should make people feel really good about buying just even the regular milk and beef at the grocery store. Both Natalie and I's, the dairy and on the beef side for Natalie, enters conventional grocery store. And I know that like I personally buy the cheapest milk on the shelf at the grocery store because I know exactly what quality standards went into it and feel so good about it. I don't worry about those kind of things. And so I always want to pass that on in talking about those misconceptions about beef and dairy. Like you should feel good about the choices you're able to make at the grocery store when buying animal protein of beef and dairy.
Yeah, Natalie, any major misconceptions about how you treat your animals? Or I mean, you hear from the activist side how you're torturing the animals, and every night you go and you beat them over the head with baseball bats. It's just such nonsense that we see. But dairy is scary and meat is murder. What is your response to that?
Yeah, it is really crazy. Our ranch is, in the grand scope of things, like a fairly larger operation. So the average herd size for a beef ranch in the United States is only 43, which I think people are shocked to know it's that small. And I think that also like lays into the factory farm kind of misconception as well. And so we're a larger operation, and it's just my husband and I, and we are absolutely not out mistreating our animals. I feel as an industry as a whole, animal welfare has never been better for our industry. I think the problem actually is, and we talked about this last week on the podcast, is when we think of animal welfare, it's coming from spending a lot of time with animals, having a very good understanding of how they need to be treated, issues with them, and basically what it is to care for an animal. And I think people who are now removed from farming and ranching may have a misconception or an idea about a way an animal should be treated without fully understanding what it is to care for an animal. And so I think there's this big disconnect about what is best for the animal. And I can assure you that farmers and ranchers are making the choices they are because it is what is best for the animal.
Yeah, I think when you see these sort of shock documentaries that these plant-based advocates, they usually show some kind of worst, awful example, and it's not what you would see consistently in any place, probably in most of the world, which are certainly not the developed world. But what about, I guess, back to, go ahead if you wanted to comment further.
I was just going to say, I'm very active on Instagram at Natalie Kovarik, and I bring my community along every single day for what we're doing on our operation. And there's absolutely nothing I would ever hide. So if you are interested in understanding and seeing what it is like to be a farmer rancher every single day and what we're doing with our animals, I would invite you to follow along. Because if I don't have a post up, I have a story up where you can release what it is like to be on a ranch and farm.
Yeah, Tara, I don't know the size. You said, I don't know the size of your operation. I know you said New Mexico's average 2,300 or something like that. And yeah, I was aware that the average cattle ranch, there used to be, I think there used to be like 1.5 million cattle ranches, and now we're down to about half that. But it was usually just these small cow-calf operations. But what are your thoughts on, like, Tara, for instance, these mega dairies, 30, 40,000 animals? Is that a problem, or is there any concerns around that many, that size of a footprint of a herd?
That is such a great question. And it is a very complicated question to answer. By all standards, I feel like if an activist came on our dairy, they would say we were a factory farm, that we're a CAFO. So our cattle are in pens, as I mentioned, open lots. They're out. They have shades, wind blocks. And at the same time, with the factory farm, I am less than 100 steps to our milking barn. My backyard, it backs up to where the calves are born. You can go out in my backyard and watch a calf being born at any time of day. My girls live here. My husband works on our dairy full time. Like, we're a family operation. Absolutely. The water that gets into my house is the same water our cows drink. Like, absolutely highest quality of care is given to these cows. And so I do think that there's a misconception that big means bad. And that's not the case, whether that's in dairy or in beef. Like Natalie mentioned, like her ranch is larger than the average ranch size. And that doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with it or that it's bad. One thing that I've seen a lot of as I've grown up in the dairy is that when my dad came of age, he went out on his own, quote unquote. Like, his brother started his own dairy. My dad started his own dairy. And now what we're seeing, actually, we see a lot of consolidation, but what I'm seeing is a lot of families staying together. So my husband dairy farms with his dad and 4 out of 5 of his brothers full time. And so instead of us each going off and having maybe a smaller dairy, what we've decided to do is that it makes more sense for us to stay together and be a larger operation so that we can have a little bit better margins. We have a little bit better buying power, whether it's buying feed or, pharmaceuticals or different things, whether that's all the way down to the gloves that our milkers use. We're able to buy a little bit more in bulk, and that saves us some money. And in agriculture, those margins really make a difference. And so I don't think big farms are necessarily bad, but the dairy industry is changing. I'm recording this podcast while my dad is currently selling out of the dairy business. And it's a weird time. And he was a larger farm. He milked 3,000 cows. He was an average herd size in New Mexico, and he's selling out. It didn't make sense anymore. And big doesn't mean you're not going to go out of business. Small doesn't mean you're not going to go to business. Big doesn't mean bad. Small doesn't mean good. It's just a really weird transition, I think, that we're experiencing in the dairy industry. And I don't know what that necessarily means for the future, but there is still 98% of dairy farms in the United States are family owned and operated. So I think that should make people feel really good about where we're at still.
Yeah, both of you are relatively, I think, somewhat unique in that, first of all, you're both female, and second, you're relatively young. I don't know what the dairy side is, but I know on the beef side, I think the average cattle rancher is something like 63 or something like that. So are we seeing an injection of younger people that are taking over the farms, or are we just going to see a continued going under of these smaller farms and continued consolidation? What are you guys' predictions? I know it's hard to predict the future, but what are you seeing trend-wise?
It is hard to predict. Part of me wants to say it's an exciting time in agriculture, and I do think we have an influx of younger generations returning back to the farm or ranch. I also think, oddly enough, social media has changed the game for some of these operations. It allows them to maybe open up a direct to consumer or have different income flows for their operations than you would traditionally have had. And I think that's sometimes what it takes to bring back that younger generation to the farmer ranch. Is can't sustain everyone. So what's going to be the new way that we are another supplemental income in stream? And so I do think we see that shift where we, having people return back to the farm and ranch. They're interested in that lifestyle. They want to maintain the heritage of it. But on the same note, I do think it is still a concern or worry that you're going to have basically it's very capital intensive to run an agriculture. And so I do think there's a concern that, for lack of a better word, consolidation or kind of a shift in less bigger operations just because of what it takes to basically stay in the game sometimes.
Yeah. As far as social media, I just found you on Instagram, just followed you, Natalie, but how has that impacted you guys, or how are you guys impacting this? Because I've interviewed like Dan Ventiker, who's the Iowa dairy farmer, and I've seen some people out there, and I'm always happy to see that because I think the side has been misportrayed by the animal activists. Very few people are now exposed to agriculture in real life. We see it in a documentary, and it's always skewed to one side. But how has y'all's experience collectively or individually been with going on social media? And thank you for doing that, because I think it is something people need to see. But what are your guys' thoughts on that?
Yeah, I feel like it's been overwhelmingly positive to be able to share online. We've talked about the activists and some negativity that we've both experienced online, but overwhelmingly, I am so glad I made the decision to be able to share and just open up our farm, even just a little bit, to a few people and just be able to show them what it's actually like. I was working as an environmental consultant when I decided to start sharing online, and it was because I was seeing things online that were not representative of what I was seeing. Here I was going to dairy farm after dairy farm across New Mexico, and it was like, this is not what's happening on these farms. They're doing really cool things. They're being really sustainable. They're constantly making changes to do better, to be better. And that was what I wanted to highlight. I personally was not doing a direct to consumer business at all. I didn't want to sell anything. I just wanted to show people some cool facts about dairy farming and its impact on the environment and what we're doing to be more sustainable. And I know Natalie can jump in and share her perspective, but then both of us, when we teamed up, wanted to go bigger. We wanted to be able to open up more of agriculture to people. And that's really at the root of our podcast, is to be able to have people understand their food system, understand where their food comes from.
Okay, let me ask you two questions for either of y'all. Why not go direct to consumer? What is it? Why? It seems like I'll tell you what, I get my meat from Costco. I get it direct from ranchers, and I also go to a local rancher. I eat a lot. I eat over 1,000 pounds of meat a year, so I consume a lot. So I get it from all sorts of sources. And then particularly, Tara, do you have any concerns with raw milk? Would you drink it? Would you have a problem with it? What are your thoughts on both of those topics? Why not direct to consumer, and then talk about raw milk?
I can take the direct to consumer one. So that was my first initial dive into social media beyond a personal use, was as a direct to consumer. I dabbled in that for about 2 years. I started a direct to consumer beef business with a friend I had back in Montana. It's really tight margins for a rancher to make that happen. And there's different things that are happening on the operation that it can make it more of a challenge to happen to. So for anyone who is listening that does buy direct to consumer directly from the ranch, thank you, because it means a lot to that ranch. It really does make a difference. I would argue that reasons to go direct to consumer versus the grocery store. If you really want to have a relationship, know where your beef is coming from, then absolutely it makes most sense to do direct to consumer. If you want to support maybe quote unquote local in that area, it makes sense to do direct to consumer. In my opinion, I don't think there is a big difference between the steak you're going to get from a direct to consumer versus the grocery store steak you're going to get. They're both graded. Whether you're getting prime from the rancher or prime from the grocery store, it's going to be the same thing. But there is a big difference between the grounded products. Grounded beef in the grocery store is a meld, right? It's different animals. We're also usually importing beef from out of country to mix with ours to give it that lean 80-20, whatever ratio it is you want. So it's a very melded product. Whereas if you are getting a ground beef from a direct to consumer, it is going to be one animal where that again, where that beef exactly came from. I'm trying to think if there's anything else with direct to consumer, but for now, that's it.
Yeah.
All right, I'll jump in on the raw milk side. I love talking about this actually because I drank raw milk until I was 25. I stopped for a couple of years in college just because it was easier to buy it from the grocery store. But essentially, I've drank raw milk for the majority of my life. And I drank it through most of my first pregnancy as well. And I had a really great doctor for my first pregnancy. He was very understanding of me drinking raw milk, but he did challenge me to dive a little deeper on why I was drinking raw milk versus conventional. And ultimately, I made the decision after that pregnancy to choose conventional milk at the grocery store. And personally, it was for a lot of reasons. I was not of the attitude that raw milk was like a superfood beyond the superfood that I think milk is, whether it's pasteurized or not. I think milk in general is just a superfood. And so I wasn't behind a lot of the health claims that it made you healthier, reduced allergies or anything. There's some really cool studies out there about the benefits of really looking at, is there benefits to raw milk? And what they have found is there's actually more benefits to just living on farm, being exposed to the atmosphere, the dirts, the soil on farm versus what you're exposed to on the raw milk side. Also, it was not always the most convenient thing for me. A lot of times my husband, the last thing he wanted to do after working at the dairy all day was to hand him the 2-gallon jugs for him to go back to the dairy and fill back up and bring back home. And then I also, as I was having kids, I didn't want to make that decision for other people's families. If we had kids over, if we had cousins over, friends over, and I didn't have regular conventional milk, I didn't feel like it was my place to offer, obviously, raw milk to somebody else. And so it was just a lot of personal reasons. I can only give my personal experience, but overall, I think no matter what you choose, I think if you choose raw milk, one of the issues I do have is if you get sick from drinking raw milk, which there are higher chances, obviously, of getting sick from drinking raw milk, just because if you ate raw sushi or you ate raw steak, know those risks, know your farmer, know your dairy farmer, and make sound choices. My doctor said it best. You probably wouldn't get raw fish off the side of the road from someone you didn't even know, couldn't inspect the back of the trailer or whatever it was. Same with raw milk. Be making sure you're making good decisions about the raw milk you're choosing, but otherwise you can feel good about choosing conventional milk as well.
Yeah.
Sorry, Shawn,
go ahead.
Sorry, there's one more thing that I think is big that I missed on the direct to consumer on the beef side, which is if you are passionate about supporting U.S. farmers and ranchers, it's also best to go direct to consumer because, again, those grocery store can be mixed products. And then we also, it's a very hot topic in the ag industry, but we don't have, there's cool country of origin of labeling. And so sometimes even though it is labeled U.S., product of the USA, it is not actually, which is very confusing for the consumer. So if you are very passionate about supporting, knowing that you are supporting U.S. farmers and ranchers, direct to consumer is going to be best as well.
Yeah, you mentioned the MCOOL. I think it was in effect for several years, and I think around 2015 or so it was repealed, and there's a lot of people upset about that. And I think particularly the packer organizations, they seem to benefit from not having it. And I guess there's some pushback from the WTO and Canada, Mexico, so on and so forth. But speaking of, I guess, on the policies, we got Senator Cory Booker, who is a vegan, sitting on the Senate Ag Committee. You've got various, Thomas Massey, who's a congressman from Kentucky, who's a rancher, I believe. What is the political landscape? Are we going to see something that's going to, processing access point was a big, during the pandemic, we saw where we had these weak in the production system. What's going on policy-wise? And are you guys personally getting some ears that people are listening to what's going on so we can move this in a way to keep you guys in business, quite honestly?
I actually just had a post go viral on LinkedIn where I was talking about how ag is not the problem. The problem is that we have people involved in making decisions for agriculture who don't fully understand what it takes to be in agriculture and just the whole landscape of agriculture. And I really firmly stand strong in that. I made that post because I believe that. I think there needs to be more farmers and ranchers at the table making these decisions. I don't think Cory Booker is like our best representative to be on the ag committee making these decisions. And so, yeah, I'm absolutely concerned about policy and what that shifts. We've already talked about even big picture of what, could happen from UN coming over for policy change. So I think it's a big worry. And it's hard because not a lot of people in agriculture, it's hard to get to that place when you're in agriculture where you're at the table and a part of the conversation and making those votes that make a difference. But I think that's a big part of the puzzle that we're missing.
Yeah, absolutely. It was like Chuck Grassley and there's some people that come from Montana and some of the representatives there that kind of maybe even grew up on those ranches. But I think who's a South Dakota Senator, Mike Rounds, I think is another guy that's a cattle guy, I think, if I'm not mistaken. But how are you seeing, is it party-wise? Is there one party that's more favorable to ag than another? Is there any sort of rhyme or reason to this?
I feel like that really depends on the state and location. I feel like we've been in a situation where we've needed to have a lot of our congressmen and women and senators out to our dairy recently in the last several years. And it's been both sides of the aisle, honestly. I think it matters to them because we're rural communities. They're being supported by rural communities. They're being voted in by rural communities, no matter which side of the aisle they're on. So they need to be a part of that conversation around ag and know who they're supporting and what we want them to support. And so I I don't know that it necessarily always is along party lines. I think one of the things that we have to think about with policy, I've recently in the last several years have gotten more involved on the UN level. One thing we think about policy within the United States, but we've got to think, we've already talked about the EU, but then the UN and the policies they pass down across the globe and what they're doing, and making sure we have a seat at those conversations and being a part of those, being active in those so that things don't happen there on that level that can impact us without us having a voice at that.
Yeah, when you talk about it in the world stage, one of the concerns, like if they cull 200,000 cattle in, say, Ireland to meet their quote unquote climate goals, what is to prevent 200,000 more cattle appearing in Namibia or Brazil or something like that? I just see where you can just shift it around. It's kind of like we export all our pollution to China basically because they do most of our industrial stuff, and so I don't know that's the right solution. Do you see anybody that seems to be, when it comes to sustainability, a really good source? I mean, we talk about Frank Mitloehner, but are there any other people out there that seem to be pushing things in a direction that makes sense?
Yeah, I think that there are lots of people doing research. I think now more than ever, we're seeing a little bit of a shift towards some of these positives. Like actually just the UN came out with a really pro meat study. It was one of the most comprehensive studies that's been done, where they looked at a number of different things that basically said that animal protein is essential for people's nutrients, which, as we've talked about, like, I think that's kind of like a like conversation. But the fact they said that it is important. It shows that there are scientists, dietitians, these policymakers that are seeing the value of animal protein and that it's needed. And you mentioned that, like, offsetting your carbon emissions on another country. I do think that's a massive problem with these culling of cows, removing of farms. Is sure, then maybe Ireland's emissions are lower, but at what cost to someplace else in another country? Did we increase emissions, maybe even increase them even more, or are they double, triple what they would have been in Ireland? And one thing that I think worries Natalie and I is in these really progressive countries where we're doing cool things and cool technology and research on agriculture, what happens when we lose those farms? We're going to lose that research, that technology that could have been developed in those countries as well. We need those countries that are doing amazing things to continue to do that, to help the rest of the world move forward and produce ag more sustainably, produce animal proteins more sustainably.
Yeah, like I'd mentioned earlier, back in 1977, I think our herd, or something, 1980, I think we had 130 million head of cattle in the U.S., and we're down about, 40% from that, somewhere in that neighborhood. My advocate is we should be eating more beef, and we should be eating more meat and potentially dairy. If we wanted to grow our cattle herd in the U.S. and other places, do we have the resources to do that? And can we do that in a sustainable fashion? Can we, like you said, you're in the business of actually regenerating soil and sequestering carbon rather than bathtub versus with the drain open, with the closed. Do we have the capacity? Could you double, triple, quadruple your herd size with the resources you have in New Mexico and then maybe in Nebraska? What are your guys' thoughts on that?
Oh, that's a really good question. Something my husband and I actually have been just talking about in general. I do not. I think that we're limited by how much feed we can grow here in New Mexico. That's limited by how much water we have. So I don't know that we could just triple the herd size here. I think that there is still opportunity for growth, but I think it will have to be very strategic and well planned out. And it is an interesting conversation with some of the even larger dairies that are growing more quickly. How are they doing that? How can we continue this? Yeah, I don't know. Natalie, you want to add to it on the beef side?
No, I think that's a really interesting question. Actually, one I've never even been asked before. And I would echo Tara in kind of the same fashion that we'll definitely have caps and limits to what we could do with where we are. But obviously, improvements could be put in any operation where you could maybe increase your stocking rate and have different, increased capacity. But I don't think I have quite a really good answer for you, Shawn. I'm sorry.
Actually, I want to add one thing before we move on. Is actually here in Eastern New Mexico during the pandemic, a lot of co-ops, and this is in different places across the country, but we actually implemented a quota system, which if you followed like the Netherlands at all and their dairy system, they had a quota system for decades, but we have implemented a quota system. So in order for us to increase our herd size, we would also have to increase the amount of quota we have that our co-op will buy that milk from us and then market it. So it would not be as simple as just like waking up tomorrow and being like, oh, let's add more cows. There would have to be a lot that would go into making that happen.
Yeah, obviously you want the market there, but I'm just wondering because we did have 40 million head of cattle than we do now today, so they had to go somewhere. They were grazing someplace. So I assume that land is potentially still available. I don't know. I mean, maybe it's been turned into urban sprawl is also a problem that a lot of people don't think about it. A lot of times we've urbanized all these previously rural areas and now you can't raise animals there anymore. Let me give you guys just, if there's anything else you want to talk about, either individually, collectively. We usually go about an hour, so we're getting close to the end, but is there anything else you want to bring up that I didn't ask about?
No, I'll start by saying thanks for having us on. You started this by thanking us, but I want to thank you and your community for being avid supporters of animal protein. It was just National or World Milk Day. It's National Dairy Month. You gave a shout out to me and a couple other dairy farmers, and it doesn't go unnoticed to have people, when there's enough people online saying negative things, it's really great. I remember the last time I was on your podcast, your community came out, showed up on my Instagram, was just so encouraging. And it really is a great reminder of doing what we do, whether that is on the dairy farming side or the cattle ranching, or even just showing up online and opening up our farms and ranches to all of you. It's amazing to see your guys' support. So thank you for that.
Yeah, it's a symbiotic relationship, and I'm happy. Yes, National Dairy Month. Last month was National Beef Month, I believe, and we don't hear about that very much. So I try to at least, because we have all these other months, and sometimes it's nice to recognize the people that actually feed us. So it's an important job. Now, anything we missed that you want to share?
No, thanks. Just like Tara said, thanks so much for having us on. I feel like this is a really well-rounded conversation. For everyone listening, if you do have follow-up questions or anything after the fact, please don't hesitate to reach out to Tara and I. And if you enjoy having deep-rooted conversations like this about ag and food and all of them, our podcast, Discover Ag, is every Thursday. I'm a little bit biased, but I think we do a really good job over there having conversations about our food system.
Yeah, you guys are both just very well-spoken, excellent representatives for what you do. And so share your social media, because some people probably want to go follow what you guys are doing. I've been following Tara for a while, but I just saw yours, so I just added you to my list of people I follow. And yeah, so share those for other people so they can find you guys.
Yeah, you can find me at Tara Vander Dussen. You can find our podcast at DiscoverAg_. Natalie?
And then mine is just my name as well. It's at Natalie Kovarik.
All right. Thank you so much for doing this and this podcast, but what you do in general. That's such an important thing, to have people show some transparency of what we're doing, so we don't just get this sort of skewed cowspiracy vegan side of everything. It's nice to see the actual stuff. And I'm just wondering, and I'm sure it's the case, how much of that negativity do you guys get brought towards you? Do you get a lot of people saying, oh, look at you, animal abuser? Did that ever appear in your social media much?
It's hit or miss. I think it gets overblown. It definitely happens. There's definitely negativity, but I think the positives far outweigh the negatives when sharing online.
I also think it depends on what type of content you're putting out. There's definitely statements, claims, pictures, videos you could show that would draw in some of that. And so I think it depends on how aggressive you're being, the conversations you're entering, the things you're talking about that really dictate if you're going to get an activist attack or not.
Yeah, I was funny. I was just in the UK and I visited UK's best butcher, and I was just doing around, and he brought out a carcass of a lamb, and I just picked it up over my head and took a picture. And I got a lot of people, oh, you're an awful person for doing that. It's there. It's real. It's reality. This is where meat comes from. And it was just funny to see that it's not, what am I supposed to, if I hold up a steak, is that any different? It's the same thing, basically. So anyway, thank you so much for doing it. You guys have a great day, and keep fighting a good fight, because we need some good warriors in this battle. So thank you very much. Hey guys, the rest of y'all, we got another one at 3 p.m. today. If you guys are interested, we got another interview with a gal that has cancer and has put it in remission using meat-based diets. So thank you so much. We'll talk to you guys soon. Bye-bye.